Hey, howdy, hey. Come in, sit down. No, not there. That's my seat. Um, Welcome. If you're watching this and you're like, what is this? I'm doing this little preamble here because the video you're about to see is a smaller part of a much larger video. It was never intended to be a standalone. The video I'm currently working on is a deep dive into the history of World Masterpiece Theater, which was a collection of anime from the 60s to the 2000s that were all kind of based on, older Western novels for kids. So the video is going to be pretty fucking huge, and for my sake, as well as YouTube's sake, because I don't want the algorithm to murder my channel before the video was actually out, I'm gonna release little chunks of the video as I finish them. So I have something to release while I'm working. Anyway, on with the show. One thing you'll see throughout this project is that World Masterpiece Theater had a variety of sponsors. From 1969 to 1978, the main sponsor was the soft drink company Calpis. That's Calpis, not Cowpiss. There were three names under this particular sponsor: Calpis Comic Theater, Calpis Children's Theater, and Calpis Family Theater. But it's best to think of them more in terms of pre-Nippon animation and post-Nippon animation. See, around episode 27 of A Dog of Flanders, Nippon Animation split from Zuio Enterprise, taking over the production wholesale for all the subsequent anime in the World Masterpiece Theater series. Now, why does any of this matter? Well, while the 4 shows I've covered do technically fall under the same umbrella, the 5 series I'm about to discuss were not officially considered part of the WMT franchise, and it'll definitely show as we go through. To discuss World Masterpiece Theater proper, we need to go back. Way back. Before Japan effectively took over the world, in anime's infancy there was Astro Boy and Osamu Tezuka. I'm sure if you're watching this, I don't need to tell you who either of these guys are, the father of manga and the Mighty Atom respectively. From August 1967 to July 1968, Osamu Tezuka's Dororo was serialized in Weekly Shonen Sunday, not to be confused with Shonen Jump, though it was cancelled before the story was finished. Our story begins in the Sengoku period, with Samurai Lord Daigo praying to the 48 demons of the Hall of Hell for power. In exchange, the demons take his firstborn son, with each taking a different part of the boy's body. Once the boy is born, he's tossed into a river and picked up by a nearby doctor who raises the boy, Hyakimaru, as his own. The doctor builds prosthetic limbs, which Hyakimaru quickly grows to master. But as he grows, he also begins to attract demons. And so, he heads out to defeat the 48 demons, with each one gaining a new body part. Overall, however, Hyakimaru only kills 21 of the 48 demons throughout the manga, an unfortunate side effect of the manga not being finished. Hyakimaru's main companion during his travels is the titular Dororo. The rough-and-tumble orphan son of bandits, Dororo joins Hyakimaru on his journey with the full intent to steal his sword, but it becomes clear throughout that the sword is just an excuse for Dororo to stick around, as he forms a pretty strong bond with Hyakimaru almost immediately. We learn early on that Dororo's parents died when he was young. Before his mother was killed, however, she drew a map on his back, which leads to his father's hidden treasure, and this becomes a pretty important plot point later in the manga. For a manga from the 60s, I was surprised how well Dororo holds up. Tezuka wasn't called the godfather of manga for no reason, and you can clearly see that in the composition and craft of this manga in particular. Tezuka frequently breaks the structure of the page and uses the format to enhance the action. There's a strange tonal dissonance between the contents of the story and the usual cutesy Tezuka art style, but I kind of love that. It keeps the manga from feeling too dreary, while also keeping the overall darker tone. It sounds weird to say, but this is a very fun manga to read, even though it does deal with themes like war and death. But then you turn the page and Dororo is back on his goofy bullshit. It's a style which obviously not everyone will get into. If you're a fan of older manga, and especially Tezuka manga, and you haven't read this one, you absolutely owe it to yourself to check this one out. After the manga's cancellation, Tezuka's company, Mushi Production, began producing an adaptation of Dororo. Tezuka pitched the series in 1968 with full-color, 30-minute pilot summarizing the story. The series was picked up for 26 episodes a year later, though in black and white due to budget constraints. Also, something interesting I found is that because the manga was basically unfinished, what was there couldn't sustain the number of episodes ordered. The last couple of episodes had stories which were basically made up of whole cloth. Was Dororo the first anime to have filler? I don't know, and I'm too lazy to look it up. The series ran from April 6th to September 28th, 1969, and despite the filler, actually had an ending. Dororo as an anime suffers from a lot of the same problems as other anime of the time. Its story is still as great as the mangas, but the action doesn't translate that well when the animation is so limited. Sometimes the quick cuts work in the action's favor, but overall the animation is very stiff. I watched the color pilot and the series, and I gotta say, I love the black and white look of this show. I think the black and white works to the anime's advantage. The colors in the pilot are fine, but having everything monochrome gives the anime a kind of creepy monster movie vibe. Honestly reminds me of Seven Samurai. As an adaptation, this is as faithful as you can get, with some minor changes. The introduction of Dororo is different. In the manga, he's attacked by bandits and Hyakimaru saves him. But here, the first thing we see is him trying to steal a bundle of swords, and I think it's a much better introduction. And in general, the first episode just gives Dororo a lot more screen time. The story of Dororo would lay dormant for decades, until in 2019 when the series was revived by Studio Mappa for a reboot. I won't spend very long talking about it because, with the exception of different characterization, it's actually a fairly faithful adaptation. The main difference between the series comes with Hyakimaru, who in this iteration becomes weaker every time he regains a limb, but without seeing it, I can't comment too much on the differences. So what we got here is a double feature, because these next two shows are adapting the same source material. I thought I'd talk about them simultaneously. Getting its start in 1945 with Moments in the Great Flood, Moomin is a series of novels authored and illustrated by Swedish-Finnish author Tove Jansson. Describing Moomin in its totality is hard, but what you need to know is both the name of the central character and the name of the series. Moomins are these hippo-looking creatures, with the main one being Moomin Troll. The books follow the Moomins and the other creatures of Moomin Valley in their daily lives. In total, there are 9 books in the main series, 6 collected volumes of the comic strip, and 5 picture books. Though for the sake of this video, I'll just be looking at how the anime compares to the books in the main series. And Moomin is fucking huge, especially in Japan. Enough so that it was adapted not 1, not 2, but 3 different times across 3 different decades. The most famous of which is the 90s adaptation, Tanoshi Moomin Ika, or simply Moomin, but we're not talking about that one today. Instead, we're talking about the Moomin series from 1969. Running from October 5th, 1969 to December 27th, 1970, for a total of 65 episodes and simply known as Moomin, the series was created without Jansson's approval, and boy does it show. The first and probably most infamous change in adaptation is the use of guns. The presence of violence in a Moomin series is immediately jarring to anyone who's read the books, or has any kind of passing familiarity with anything about the series. The characters also frequently got drunk and got into fights. Additionally, character designer Yasuo Otsuka altered the design of many of the characters, with the most notable change being the visible mouths, which made the Moomin trolls resemble hippos more than Jansson's original illustrations. started out the first episode of Moomin 69 being ambivalent towards the series. Like, it's a fine introduction, but nothing especially noteworthy. A more chaotic, less good version of the 90s anime's first episode. But then I got to episode 2 and I was immediately sold. This one's got some real Wile E. Coyote-ass energy and showcases what I believe to be Moomin 69's greatest strength, its comedic timing. And boy howdy does this show have good comedic timing. It's an instance where the limited animation actually works really well, making the jokes and punchlines feel snappy. And I think the out-of-pocket violence just adds to the comedy. Like, why does Snork literally always have beef with Moomin? Like, in every scene. I mean, really, any scene where the characters get into fights is just great, because it's just so antithetical to every Moomin thing you've ever seen. But despite its differences from the original books, it still retains the same adventurousness and charm. And it also helps that the people creating the show really did their homework. There's several episodes that either pay homage to, or are based directly on stories from the original books. And for the most part, the characters are all pretty consistent with their book counterparts. And that brings us to a subject which concerns everyone's favorite vagabond, Snufkin. Episode 4 is the first appearance of Snufkin, which, for such a major character, it's kind of surprising it takes till episode 4 to introduce him. But, man, this is a hot take, but I'll say it anyway. This is my favorite iteration of Snufkin. Something about the color scheme, design, voice actor, guitar, I don't know. But basically, anytime he shows up on screen, the episode immediately gets better. Especially in the most infamous episode of the whole series, episode 5. Ooh boy, episode 5. This is the gun episode. And if you thought this episode would ease you in, nope! We start off with Moomin Papa reminiscing on his days as a hunter, with a shot of his gun collection front and center. Now, admittedly, thinking his unintentional kill is a great achievement is something Moomin Papa would do, but buckle up, cause shit's about to get weird. So Moomin Troll decides that he wants to shoot shit, taking one of the guns out for a little spin. Things are going well until little Mai picks up the gun and ends up pissing off an eagle, though she and Moomin are saved by Snufkin, who also has a gun, because everybody in this episode has a gun. There's a great, hilariously awkward scene when Moomin Papa discovers what happened with the gun. Absolutely unhinged. This entire episode is unhinged, and I love it. Once you get over the shock of seeing Moomins with guns, it's actually a pretty good episode. This episode is peak. It's both ironically and unironically entertaining, and even without the novelty of watching these cute characters do uncute things, it still manages to have a handful of great moments. God, it's like if Winnie the Pooh had guns. It's just some shit straight out of South Park. You'll notice that, thus far, I haven't had a whole lot to say about individual episodes, and that's because, for a lot of these episodes, there just isn't a lot to say. I'd say there are 3 categories of Moomin 69 episodes, and these sometimes overlap. The whatever episodes, the what the fuck episodes, and the peak episodes. Most episodes are enjoyable enough, but there's just not a lot to dig into there. Like, there's one episode where they go to the moon, and it's one of my favorite episodes of the series, but there just isn't a whole lot to say about it. And that's kind of how I feel about Moomin 69 in general. Like, it's not bad, it's not a bad adaptation, certainly not deserving of basically being stuck in the vault from now until the end of time, but it's also just not great. Like, once you get past all the dramatic departures from the source material and just look at it on its own merits, it's a fine little show. But the thing it lacks, the thing that makes it both a poor adaptation and kind of a bad show, is that it lacks heart. Like, sure, it's fun to watch the characters get into fights and be assholes, but there's little of the warmth between the characters that you'd find in, say, the 90s series. In 1969, Suiyo Enterprises bought the rights to produce a Moomin adaptation, but starting at episode 27, animation production would be taken over by Mushi Production. This, following Janssen's dissatisfaction with how the series had been handled up to that point. The show, in its new, slightly improved, toned-down form, would run for 33 more episodes, until it was cancelled and replaced with a semi-sequel series, Shin Moomin, or New Moomin. That's not what I wrote down. Shin Moomin would run for a total of 52 episodes from January 9th, 1972 to December 31st, 1972. Most of the original staff stayed on for Shin Moomin, including Mushi production. Overall, the series was much closer to the original books, though with some minor design alteration, such as the larger black eyes. Despite this being a more faithful adaptation, Janssen still hated it, although both series were extremely popular in Japan. And in particular, the 69 series was really popular with young boys. Despite the warm reception of both series, to this day the Janssen estate has refused to release them outside of Japan. Both had limited releases on home media, and only in Japan. Moomin 69 in particular is also just tangled up in copyright hell due to the multiple production companies involved, and to this day many of its episodes are considered lost. Shin Moomin is considered a more faithful adaptation relative to its 69 counterpart, so I'm interested to see if it actually is, and what, if anything, is the difference between these two. And right off the bat, there are things I really like about this one, and things I don't. Like, I like the cuter, more rounded style, but the fact that Moomin still had mouths bothers me immensely. Like, out of all the things to carry over from 69, why that? The animation is also significantly smoother. Even comparing the respective OPs, it's clear Shin Moomin's animation is just better all around. I'm also not overly fond of the colors for the Moomins. Might just be my copy, but the colors in a lot of these scenes tend to be kind of muddy and gross. But on the other hand, I also think a lot of the colors look really nice in this. There's a lot of really beautiful, vibrant blues and yellows, and that really makes the show a joy to look at. Content-wise, this show's been toned down a lot. There's way less guns, much to my chagrin. The characters also get into less fights, and anything else objectionable from the 69 series is basically gone. Now, in some ways, this makes Shin Moomin a better show. It's got more of the heart that was missing previously, but I also miss the pure batshittery of the 69 series. Like, there's a few uses of guns in this, but nothing that feels too radically different for a Moomin show. And I kind of miss the chaos of the characters just absolutely throwing hands at every opportunity. On the positive side, the show still has a great sense of humor. The animation might be smoother, but the comedic timing is still sharp as ever. The animation upgrade also allows for much more exaggeration and goofiness in the comedy. As usual, Snufkin continues to be the best, though I definitely prefer his 69 color scheme. Also, because I don't know where else to put this, Shin Moomin is the first adaptation to feature the character of Tutiki, and I think that's neat. She's definitely a welcome presence here, and I wish there were more of her. One thing I find odd in both series is the presence of the policeman as a main character. Like, this police guy shows up in almost every single episode, and it's weird because this isn't a prominent character in the books at all. To add to that, I think it brings Moomin Valley closer to reality in a not good way. And it makes the show feel more stifled because the characters aren't solving their own problems. Or, to put it another way, it takes the characters' agency away. Overall, I like both series pretty equally, with a slight preference for Shin Moomin, if only for its animation and art direction, but really neither series holds a candle to the 90s adaptation. Between the end of Shin Moomin and the start of the final show of the Kalpus Comic Theater run, 2 shows came out, neither which I have all that much to say about. The first is Andersen Monogatari. Even if you've never heard of him, you've probably seen or read something by Hans Christian Andersen. Disney's adaptations of The Snow Queen and The Little Mermaid are among the most popular and iconic animated movies of all time, and his stories have received countless adaptations across mediums, and that includes anime. One notable anime adaptation is the 1975 Toei version of The Little Mermaid, noteworthy for its accuracy to the source material when compared with the Disney movie. 4 years earlier, however, there was another adaptation, Andersen Stories, or Andersen Monogatari. Released from January 3rd to December 26, 1971 for a total of 52 episodes and produced by Zuiyu Enterprise and Mushi Production, Andersen Monogatari is an anthology series adapting the eponymous author's various short stories. For a total of 31 segments spanning each of its 52 episodes. The series is also one of the rare entries in WMT to receive an English dub. However, that comes with the caveat that copies of the dub are extremely hard to find. But I don't think we're missing much. Apparently, many of the show's episodes were heavily changed from their Japanese counterparts, to the show's detriment. The show uses a framing device of 2 pixies, Candy and Zuko, who attempt to intervene in the plots of various Andersen stories. That's the title. To change their endings for the better, without much success. This one's got kind of a fractured fairy tales vibe, which is definitely a compliment in my eyes, but other than that, I don't have much to say about it. The second series, airing a year later, is Fables of the Green Forest, based on the works of T.W. Burgess. Thornton Burgess was an American conservationist and author known for a series of books called the Bedtime Story books. Burgess's conservationism played a large role in his writing, as he would base his books on his outdoor observations. He would write his first book based on those observations in 1910, that being Old Mother West Wing. At the time of his death, Burgess had written over 15,000 stories and more than 170 books. For our purposes, however, we need only concern ourselves with the 20 books in the Bedtime Story series. The Bedtime Story books was a series of 20 books named for Burgess's newspaper column, Bedtime Stories. The books take place in the Green Forest, also known as the Green Meadow or the Smiling Pool, with each book focusing on one of the forest's many inhabitants. The books are largely unconnected, but feature a recurring cast of animal characters, including Johnny Chuck and Peter Cottontail. Between 1969 and 1972, the Bedtime Story books were republished in Japanese. A year later, Suiyo Eizo adapted the books into a 52-episode series. Originally known as Rocky Chuck the Mountain Rat, it ran from January 7th to December 30th, 1973. In a rarity for World Masterpiece Theater, an English version was produced in 1978, which renamed the series to Fables of the Green Forest, which is what I'm going to call it from now on. Heidi, Girl of the Alps marks a turning point for World Masterpiece Theater, as it's the final entry in the Kalpis Comic Theater series before Suiyo Eizo folded into Nippon Animation. And stylistically, it bears more of a resemblance to later anime in the timeline. The orphan protagonist and vaguely 19th century setting are both things which would carry over into future shows. I'll get more into that in part 2, but Heidi is where World Masterpiece Theater really solidifies in its identity. So it's an important show to talk about. Johannes Spiri originally published the story of Heidi in 2 parts, between 1880 and 1881. The first part being called Heidi, Her Years of Wandering and Learning, and the second part being called Heidi, How She Used What She Learned. The book is one of the best-selling children's books of all time, being translated into English 13 times between 1882 and 1959. The book also garnered several sequels, though none were actually written or endorsed by Spiri. And, of course, the book spawned 1,000,001 adaptations. Beyond the anime, the most notable adaptation, the one I imagine most of you all have seen, is the 1937 movie starring Shirley Temple. The success of Heidi made the Swiss Alps a popular tourist destination, in particular for Japanese tourists, with an entire area of Switzerland being named for the book. In 1967, Shigeto Takahashi, founder of Suiyo Eizo, produced a 5-minute pilot for an adaptation of Heidi. The project was shelved until 1973, when a new pilot was produced with character design by Yasuji Mori. Despite it being the thing that got the show picked up, the 73 pilot was never shown publicly, with only a few animation cells and pieces of concept art surviving. Yuichi Kotabe, who you'll recognize from his Mario art, was brought on as a character designer to rework Mori's designs. The late great Isao Takahata came on to direct, while Hayao Miyazaki worked on layout. Kotabe, Takahata, Miyazaki. It was this dream team that shaped Heidi into its final form. In order to depict the Swiss Alps accurately, Takahashi sent his crew to Mayenfield. They stayed in the Heidi Alp hut, which served as an inspiration for the grandfather's hut, and traveled to Frankfurt. Heidi's design evolved a lot during this time, as Kotabe sketched. The resulting sketches from the trip served as the basis for the backgrounds. The anime lasted from January 6, 1974 to December 29, 1974 for a total of 52 episodes, and was popular enough to be dubbed into over 20 languages, which includes English. Actually, funny story about that. So there were several English dubs produced, the first of which was from 1985 and renamed the series to The Story of Heidi. The series was cut down extensively to be formatted for VHS. Basically, they cut down the series into a movie. But the more interesting English dub is the one that premiered in 2001 on Cartoon Network India as part of their Toonami block. A few clips of the dub have surfaced, but much of it is still lost. The idea of Heidi airing on Cartoon Network in any form is just so surreal to me, I couldn't not cover it. At present, 25 episodes of the 52 have been found, but I looked and I can only find 2 full episodes and a couple of clips. Let's go back to Takahata for a bit, because he's actually going to be a pretty important player in the WMT story going forward. Isao Takahata got his start as an assistant director at Toei, though he would leave in 1971. But his experience at Toei is important, as it would be here that he would meet another young animator named Hayao Miyazaki. After leaving Toei, Takahata and Miyazaki would go on to work on developing an adaptation of Astrid Lindgren's Pippi Longstocking. That never got off the ground, but much of the scrap work for that project ended up in the 1972 film Pandico Panda. That film also brought along the likes of Yasuo Otsuka and Yuichi Kotabe, both of whom would go on to work on Heidi. Stylistically, I would call Takahata a realist. His works are often slow-paced and focus more on mundane aspects of life rather than the more grand, fantastical stories of Miyazaki. And you can see this style shine through very clearly in the direction of Heidi. From the first episode, the show is slower and more deliberate in its pacing. You can see a lot of Ghibli DNA in this. In that very specific way, Ghibli movies frequently slow down to focus more on mundane actions like eating. Cheese and bread never look so good. It's a very peaceful show. I first watched Heidi in 2020, and let me tell you, a show like this was a welcome respite during the pandemic. There's moments here where we're just watching the characters rest. Nothing else is happening, and you'd think that'd be boring as hell, but it's really not. It's peaceful. This is a show where if you're having a bad day, you can put on almost any episode and have a pretty good time. I've heard some criticism of the original book, but I think it could be applied to the anime as well, that it idealizes alpine life. And, I mean, I don't disagree with that assessment, but I don't necessarily see it as a negative. Switzerland is one of the most beautiful countries in the world, after all, and fiction often paints a more idealized picture of reality by its very nature. And if you thought the book painted a very idealized picture of the Swiss Alps, you haven't seen the anime. One thing I think is underrated when talking about animation is the specific type of animation used and how that can enhance the work. In this case, the traditional ink and paint lends Heidi a cozy, old-fashioned look, fitting for a story like this. The Alps get as much time in the visual spotlight as the characters do, becoming characters unto themselves. And the beautiful watercolor backgrounds make the setting feel alive and vibrant. It's the kind of look and feel you just can't replicate with computers. Put a pin in that, we'll come back to it. And when we get to Frankfurt, the art design also does a great job of conveying just how stuffy and boxed in it is when compared with the wide-open Alps, bursting with color and light. It makes the environments feel lived in, tangible, and cozy. That's a word I just can't help but use to describe this show, but it's so fitting. And for an anime from the 70s, it's probably one of the best looking. The animation has aged remarkably well. But the art design, and specifically the background design, serves a very important story purpose, which I suppose because this is an adaptation, I should talk about that for a bit. In order to hit the 52 episode mark, a lot of additional content needed to be added. It might be tempting to consider this fluff, or filler, or unnecessary, but I'll explain why it isn't in a second. In the book, we get about 3 chapters in before Heidi goes to Frankfurt, whereas it takes until episode 18 in the anime before the Frankfurt storyline is introduced. This, I think, is probably the biggest change in adaptation, but it's an important one. Because we spend so much of the early episodes in the Alps immersed in the environment, it allows us a greater opportunity to view the story from Heidi's perspective. We come to love the Alps and everything therein as she does, so when the story pivots to Frankfurt, we feel her disappointment and dissatisfaction. Thus far I've been singing the show's praises, but if I had to be negative on anything, it's that the Frankfurt portion of the show, while somewhat enjoyable in its own right, is easily my least favorite part of the whole thing. It's monotonous and kinda boring, but I think that's the goal. For both the book and the anime, I was kinda just waiting for that portion to be over so we could get back to the interesting stuff. But that's why the early portions of the show are so important, because they give you a reason to give a fuck. This also works later when Clara comes to the Alps. Her recovery is more drawn out in the show, which makes the moment where she finally walks all the more satisfying. Character-wise, the slower pace also works really well. You have a lot of time to get to know each of the characters, and that makes them more endearing. Like, take the grandfather, or Uncle, for example. You really get a sense from watching him that although he's a curmudgeon, he really does care deeply for Heidi, and Peter for that matter. Also, side note, I love how in both versions he calls Peter the Goat General. It's very cute. I must also commend the writing of the kid characters as well. Kids are almost always hard to write, but here I think the team really nailed both the best and worst of kids. Heidi and Peter feel very much like a brother and sister in their closeness, but also in the way they frequently butt heads. They both have their immature or bratty moments, but they also have their golden moments. They feel like real kids, and the same goes for Clara, a character that in lesser hands could have come off as very flat. Overall, from what I can tell, the characters weren't dramatically changed too much from their book counterparts. Peter's jealousy is toned down a bit, and his gluttony is played up a bit more, mainly for comedy, but other than that and some minor changes, I didn't notice too much of a difference. Heidi effectively changed the game for World Masterpiece Theater. While it was not, by any stretch, the first anime ever to have a continuous story, it was the first in the Kalpis Comic Theater lineup to do so, and it set the standard for everything that comes next. Dororo doesn't count, by the way. Its story was never finished, and it's more episodic than it is a continuing narrative. We get a lot more anime in the vein of Heidi, and a lot less in the style of Moomin from here on out. And the anime was extremely successful, bolstering the already pretty big tourist industry in Switzerland, and still being pretty huge in Japan today. It was hugely important for Takahata and Miyazaki's careers, and for the history of anime as a whole. I really cannot overstate how important this show is. In 2015, a CGI remake of the anime would be produced. It ran for 65 episodes between 2015 and 2016. The series is a collaboration between Belgian, German, Australian, French, and Italian studios, but notably no Japanese. What the fuck? I sort of skimmed the series to see how it compared. It's fine, but I really did not care for the animation. The texturing isn't great, and the actual character animation feels kinda stiff. I don't know, I think some of the lighting is alright, but 3D animation really does not work for a series like this. The environments feel kinda lifeless and empty, as there's a lack of detail in the look of everything. I don't know, it's not really my thing. You know what is my thing? References and homages. I said earlier that Heidi has an enduring popularity in Japan, and that means that little references to it in anime will show up from time to time. Even as recently as 2024 with the remake of Ranma 1/2. It seems that Japan just can't forget Heidi. And beyond Japan, you might recognize Heidi from this meme, which is probably one of my favorite meme formats of all time. Also, I found this absolutely insane commercial for cup noodles that's kind of a quasi-sequel to the series. I need you all to see this, because if I had to see this, you have to see this. I think I might be in too deep at this point. I've been researching this for months, and I gotta stop. These early Kalpis Comic Theater anime are interesting, in that they lay the groundwork for everything to come, and yet have significant stylistic differences from the shows coming up. By the end of Heidi, Zuio was on its way out, and with it, big changes were coming.